All right. Shall I get started, Erin?
Please.
All right. Welcome, everyone. You have just joined the Building a Culture of Staff Wellness through an MTSS. We're happy that you are here. My name is Amy Flamini. I work for the Midwest PBIS Network, and this is my colleague, Kimberly Yannick. If you'll give him a wave. There you go. And then Erin, who is our tech assistant / do all everything else person. So thanks for joining. So we are going to get started. I'm just going to review a couple of things since Brian reviewed the information at the very beginning of the keynote. And that is that when you want to ask us questions that we would address at the end of the session, the idea is that you would go under the Q&A under polls, and that's where you will put your questions for Kimberly and I. If you want to chat like, hey, I'm in Arizona and it's gorgeous, or if you want to share something with a colleague, please feel free to share that in your Pathable chat box. If you navigate away from Pathable, all you need to do is click back to your agenda, go in and click on join meeting again, and you should be good to go. And if you have any other trouble that is tech related, you can click on the help desk at the top of your screen. So Kimberly and I have had such a great time putting this together. Over the period of months and months and months, we've been talking about how to get this information to you. And I would suggest to you that it's a lot of information. So I would say, take what works for you, leave the rest, and hopefully we're going to be planting some seeds about a culture of wellness. So we want to recognize that we have used 3 books to help guide our discussions and some of this content where we will have referenced it. But we wanted to show you the books. So the first one is Emotional Agility by Susan David. Kimberly's like, she's going to do the Price is Right thing right here. Emotional Agility. Thank you. The second one is Altered Traits, and it's by Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson. Thank you. And the third one is called The Burnout Epidemic, and it's by Jennifer Moss. And it looks like that, with a lot of like highlighters and stickies, which is Kimberly and I's mode of operation. So if we could change the name of our session, we probably would have. So we would rename it a two-pronged approach to a culture of wellness within an MTSS. We would do this because what we really want you to walk away with today is that in order for there to be a culture of wellness, 2 prongs, so to speak, have to be in place. So if you think of a 2-pronged plug-in, like how you charge your iPhone or Android or whatever, if you think of a 2-pronged plug, both prongs have to go into the socket in order to get the electricity. And so we want you to make sure that you leave today understanding there are 2 big pieces of this puzzle. In this case, 1 prong is the work that we do each as individuals. And we do these things individually to live our best life, to have a strong sense of self-efficacy beliefs. And we want to be making a decision. We want to make all of our decisions from a place of well-being. That's the first prong. The second prong is all systems and making organizational change. And that part has been left off some in the pandemic. Everything's been heightened, right? And sometimes we get really into telling people to take care of themselves and to say no and to go to yoga. And what we want you to walk away with is this is way bigger than go to yoga. So we hope that you walk away with that. In the first part, we've organized in 2 parts today. In the first part, we're going to briefly share with you some background information about stress and burnout. We're not going to spend a lot of time there, but there's some pretty specific things we want you to remember about that, about stress and burnout. And what those 2 things are actually is that we are going to ask you to consider that stress, when we're talking about stress, we're talking about individuals. And when we're talking about burnout, we're talking about organizations. So after we lay the groundwork for those things, we're going to lead you down the path of what can be important for individuals to know about your own psychological functioning and your own well-being. and our own well-being directly impacts kids. So two prongs and the way we show up every day impacts kids. Those are some of the big messages for today. We are also going to explore mindfulness as one strategy that we can use to show up every day as our best selves. The second section, Kimberly is going to jump in. She may jump in before that, but the second section Kimberly is going to focus on, and that's going to be about the systems in the organization and what needs to happen in order for MTSS to be the way that you create and sustain a culture of wellness. So that's our plan. So we want to emphasize again, we're going to do this like 100 times maybe, that this work cannot all fall on individual educators. It cannot fall on individual educators. We've learned over the course of the pandemic that this wellness work is way bigger than all of those things I mentioned before, way bigger than going to Tai Chi, way bigger than getting more sleep, although sleep's important and Tai Chi is important, right? But it's bigger than that. And MTSS is going to be it's going to be the golden key really here to help us have a platform to shift gears, to go bigger, and to ensure that we're not blaming and shaming individuals. It's super easy to talk about individuals and self-care in a really shaming kind of, this is your fault that you are burnt out way. And we really want to make sure that we're clear that that needs to not be the case. So we're going to create a common understanding and lay the groundwork for the rest of our presentation. So I feel fairly confident you all could define stress by a million of examples over the last 18 months, maybe the last few hours, I don't know, maybe like in 5 minutes ago, but everybody here who's participating can identify what stress means. I want to point out a couple of things about it though. I want you to remember and think a little bit about the fact that what is stressful for every person can be different, which means that what I experience as stressful, you might not find stressful at all, which then I come back to that and think, well, that means that event that I'm telling you is stressful is not inherently stressful to everyone, right? So I have to kind of be cognizant of that when I'm thinking about my own well-being and how I work and how I deal with stressors. There's no agreed definition about stress, mostly because it's so individual. We're going to go with a definition provided by the American Institute of Stress, which is a great resource. And this is the one we think is going to resonate most with educators. Stress is a condition or feeling experienced when a person perceives that demands exceed the personal and social resources the individual is able to mobilize. So social resources the individual is able to mobilize. It's bigger than what we have. It's bigger than what we think we can cope with or what we can deal with. One of the things that we know is that there is more and more research about stress in educators happening. And what we want to point out is, so in addition to, we know that there's an unhealthy, prolonged stress on our emotional, physical health and well-being and behavior. But we also want you to know that there's research about how educators stress. So when educators feel stress, it impacts all facets of education. So when we show up stressed out or not functioning from our best space or showing up as our best selves, it impacts lots of things, including workforce retention, like whether we stick around or we go become a barista, which is always my kind of dream side job, or whether we're gone, whether we're absent a lot. It also impacts student performance, and it impacts how we are doing socially and emotionally as adults. And all of those things impact kids. Another way to say that is our mood, how we show up with kids matters. We now can give you more details even about why it matters. We know that stress is a natural thing. We know that it's a physical or mental reaction to life. Everyone experiences stress from time to time. And those can really vary from stress like I lost all my notes for this PowerPoint at 10:30 last night and then decided I needed to cry a little, have a glass of port, and then go to bed. Or that could be one example. Or it could be like you have a serious diagnosis, or someone you love has COVID, or all different kinds of things can trigger stress. Not all stress is bad. There's really good stress. The stress that I feel before I present is good stress because it helps me move forward. The stress you feel if you are married the day before you get married or the day of your wedding, that's good stress, right? That's not necessarily bad. So stress isn't good or bad. Stress is just stress. In short-term stress is also helpful to your health. It can really help you cope with very serious things. So your body is just programmed to release hormones that will increase things like your heart rate and your breathing rate and how your muscles are going to respond. All of those are super important. The thing about stress is when we respond to stress, we're in a great place in terms of that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to have a physical response. But if that stress response doesn't back off, if we stay in that stress response all the time, our bodies can really be impacted, and you might not see those impacts. Like on the right of the slide, you can see those are impacts that you could probably see in me, like irritability, anxiety, some of those things. But I also want to point out to you that when you have chronic stress, or when you are in a stress kind of response, your hormones kick in and make your heartbeat go faster, and it sends blood to areas that need it in your body so that you can respond. Another way to say that is your body is going to get ready to run from a tiger or a bear, and a lot of stuff's going to happen on the inside of your body. Stress hormones also cause our blood vessels to constrict and divert more oxygen to our muscles, so we have strength to take action. The thing about that is it also raises your blood pressure. So if you're in chronic stress all the time, then more than likely it will impact your blood pressure. It will impact how you digest food. It can increase your risk of developing type 2 diabetes. It can change your energy levels. If you are in a chronic, like immediate state of stress, that's great. You want your muscles to tense up and be ready to do whatever. But if that doesn't back off, then what happens is that stress kind of gets into our body, we tense up, we tense our muscles. And then what happens is we have things like back pain or shoulders or tight shoulders or headaches or other kinds of body aches. Finally, the last three things I want to point out here are that stress, chronic stress, can interfere with male testosterone, and it can interfere with women's cycles, and it can dampen your immune system. It can really, over time, weaken our immune system. So there are tons and tons of reasons why we need to be on top of this. If for no other reason, that it is impacting your body, whether you can see it or not, it's impacting your body. One of the ways that it impacts it, there was a little tiny piece of this on that last slide, but one of the ways it impacts it is it impacts our sleep. 26% of women have report trouble sleeping at least once a week, compared to 16% of men. And this is also from stress.org. 19% of individuals aged 45 to 64 admit to losing sleep due to stress a few nights a week. And 54% say that stress or anxiety increased your anxiety about falling asleep. Like there's nothing worse than being anxious about not being able to fall asleep. That's a really great way to become more anxious. About 1 in 3 Americans describe sleep problems. So what you could say is most of us are not getting enough sleep. 1 in 3 Americans are not getting enough sleep. And sleep is tied to our well-being. And if you're not sure if that statement rings true for you, what I want you to think about is, when's the last time you didn't sleep? And what was the rest of that week like for you? Or the day after you didn't sleep? So I think it's really important for us to think about this, because If we're educators and our job is to show up our best selves, to work with our most vulnerable youth, then we got to be on our game, right? And that requires us to be paying attention to some of these factors. So I just talked to you about stress and how it impacts us as individuals. Remember, two prongs: individual, organizations, and systems. So I just talked stress about individuals. And now I want to point out to you some things about burnout. So we go back to the just say no, set boundaries, go on vacation, use meditation apps. And all those things can be healthy. They can help us feel better. They can help us show up better. However, if you want to address the burnout problem, the first step is repeating and internalizing this mantra. Burnout is about your organization. It is not about your people. Burnout organizations stress individuals. So another way to say that is that we can no longer responsibly suggest that wellness strategies, we can no longer suggest wellness strategies that place ownership on individuals for preventing and managing their own burnout. Instead, we as leaders have to look at how we're doing, what our organization looks like, and the role our organization plays. The World Health Organization, this is kind of, I thought, Kimberly and I thought this was interesting. The World Health Organization describes burnout as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And that definition is so important because what it does is it highlights that this is more than an employee problem. It's an organizational problem that is going to require an organizational solution. This is a touch base on some of the causes of burnout. Workload, which everybody says, right? Everybody says they have too much work. And that's true for most people. They do have too much work. Educators have too much work on their plate. They have too many tasks to do. And since the pandemic, what we see in the research is people are working longer hours. They feel like they're always on more times. They feel like they're reporting doing more tedious tasks. And this number was a little shocking to me, but there's some research showing that we are all having 13% more meetings in our lives than we were pre-pandemic. So if you wondered why you were tired of Zoom, that might have something to do with it. The next one is perceived lack of control. And when you think of perceived lack of control, I want you to think about micromanagement. So leaders are also at risk for burnout from micromanagement. A leader being a micromanager leads employees to feel like they don't have any control. And leaders who are micromanagers are also really at risk for burning out because they're failing to effectively delegate tasks. They end up working overtime to fulfill very kind of daily obligations versus being a leader who is able to strategically plan for the future. And that's really hard, right, when we're in crisis mode during COVID in a building. And it's just something to kind of think about and let it simmer for a little bit. Like, is micromanagement really impacting our employees and their burnout rate? Lack of rewards is a cause of burnout. And I want you to think, I know that sounds fairly obvious, but I also want you to think about, are people paid what they are worth? That's considered a reward and recognition. Do people have access to pay when they need it? So do hourly workers have access to pay prior to payday? Are our workers being listened to? Are they having their ideas heard? And even more important, when our leaders hear our ideas, are those ideas implemented? Because that's a form of recognition. Poor relationships. We all know that community drives belonging, and belonging is connected to well-being. And it is connected to the success of any organization. Lack of fairness. So the things that can happen when an employee reports there being a lack of fairness at work includes there's no mechanism for filing a complaint. or we don't all have a shared understanding of what unfair means, or every grievance isn't responded to, or people are getting rewarded who really aren't doing the work. And we also need to think about lack of fairness as the inequities in our organizations and the inequities in our communities that impact our employees. So this list clearly demonstrates the root causes of burnout. So the research around burnout, if you were going to look at what the causes were, these are the 6 that would float to the top. And they don't lie in the individual. They can be averted. And what we need are leaders who start upstream. So we don't want our leaders downstream, like pulling people out of the stream. We want them to go upstream and fix the bridge so that they don't have to pull people out of the proverbial downstream. There are other barriers that are connected that we're proposing are connected to burnout. And the one I'm going to pay attention to those top 2 first. So rewarding busy and overwhelm. So that is that belief that the more stressed you are means you care more than everyone else. Or the busier you are, the more committed or the better you are. It's the glorification of busy. And that's a problem within an organization. That does not support employees having the opportunity to practice self-care. So then let's highlight the multitasking piece. So we all need to get over the idea that multitasking is real, because it is not real. Multitasking, Kimberly and I felt like we needed to remind ourselves of this sometimes while we were getting ready for this, because there's really compelling research out of Stanford that shows that multitasking is a myth. It's not a thing. Multitasking is not a thing. The brain does not multitask. The brain switches from one activity to another activity to another activity. And there was a scientist who made this observation. He made a couple observations, but one was, what information consumes is our attention, and a wealth of information then means a poverty of attention. What information consumes is our attention, and a wealth of information means a poverty of attention. If we're multitasking, which we can stop saying that word, we can just get rid of it. That's not really, we're not really giving the attention to what we need to give attention to. So why is all of this important in terms of education and what it is like when you show up? It's important because we want to show up as our very best selves. We know that schools that prioritize staff wellness demonstrate positive staff interactions. And those are schools that have a shared commitment to success. They have a collective efficacy. They believe they can make a difference, which Kimberly is going to touch on a little bit later. So in order to show up as our best selves, what do we each need to do? What is that going to look like for you? What does that keep you? How do you keep yourself straight psychologically? Like, how do you keep everything kind of moving in the right direction? And so in chat, while Amy takes a drink, in chat, if you would identify wellness. So we want you to think about these questions. How do you define wellness? How do you prioritize wellness? And in chat, I'd love for you to share, how do you know when you're showing up as your best self? So I'd love for you to take a second and write that in chat. All right, thank you for the beverage break. So I covered a bit about stress and burnout, right? That was laying the groundwork. And now we're going to really dive into that first prong, the well-being of the individual. So I would suggest to you that well-being is not a fixed definition, and it's not static. It fluctuates, right? Well-being is what you are at the core. So an example of that is the sun is always shining, even when there are clouds behind it. Your well-being is always there, no matter what is happening around here. It's still in there. It's like the sun. So well-being has a lot of different ways it can look in people, right? It can be that I have a positive outlook. It can be that I know to savor that last piece of chocolate as opposed to gobble it down and not notice I ate it. It can be resilience. It can show up as resilience, that ability to rebound from negative emotions. It can be mindfulness, meaning we are paying attention to what we are doing in front of us, as opposed to our mind wandering off all the time. And well-being is when we have the mojo to actually care for others. Those are examples of well-being. So well-being, if we're going to go with well-being as your default setting and it's your baseline, then what we need to know is, how do you know when you're not responding from a place of well-being? How can you, as an individual, remember first prong, how can you as an individual tell moment to moment whether you're living from a place of well-being? I can share examples of well-being as a sense of calm, a sense of responding to events in calm, a sense of having a purpose, a sense of self-efficacy, meaning I believe that I have an impact, that I have the ability to have an impact. So we're going to just give you a couple of examples of that before I toss this over to Kimberly. So there's potential bad news and there's good news. And we're going to start with what I'm going to refer to as the potential bad news. So consider the possibility that we've had this backwards for a long time, that well-being isn't dependent upon outside factors that are out of your control. It doesn't mean things aren't hard. It means that you can still be okay when things are hard. The bad news happens when we believe happiness and peace of mind are contingent upon everything outside of us. What happens then is life, right? All the things that go wrong. We're late, a student fails a test, everyone's moving to virtual learning, you get behind in your work, you're quarantined. A million things happen in our life. That's life. And if in life, we're going to allow our inside world, meaning our well-being, our happiness, to depend on the outside world, well, we're probably going to be in some trouble, because what that means is everything outside of us has to be perfect and in line for us to be okay. And you are okay at your core. It's a matter of how do we move and live from that place. If you're waiting on everything else, then, for example, if you're waiting on the planets to align, you are not going to be okay until 2492. And that's a really long time away. So I would suggest that we don't do that. Here's the best news. The best news is that we are resilient humans. We're born resilient. We have well-being inside of us. It's innate to us. And our brains are not set. They're malleable. Your brain can change. We can have patterns that we live with that can go away because they're no longer useful to us. And we can take on new patterns of how we live our life. We're not locked into anything. And if you've never checked out Healthy Minds from Madison, Wisconsin, they have so much great information. And I just wanted to, there was a quote in there about innate basic goodness being in all of us. And we can practice responding from a place of well-being and innate goodness. The other good news is that our mood comes from our thinking. Thinking and feeling are two sides of the same coin. So please let me be very, very clear. I am not saying go change your thinking. I'm not saying let it go. I'm not saying ignore it. I'm not saying anything like that. What I'm saying is that your thinking is connected to your moods, and your moods are like your feelings and emotions and moods are like the rumble strips on the side of a road. They are our early warning system. Our feelings, our mood tell us whether or not we need to pause in the space. There's a pause-o-meter, there's a pause button, and those rumble strips, they can tell us if we're headed off the road. There needs to be that space, because that's where we can respond to youth and respond to challenges and respond to stress, as opposed to reacting. The warning strips are giving us constant feedback. Side note, airplanes are on autopilot most of the time, and they are actually off course 90% of the time, constantly providing feedback to make adjustments. So we want to become more sensitive to our moods, because that's like the machine on the airplane. That was pretty formal. The machine on the airplane pointing out that it's off track. So when our moods, and we're paying attention to our moods, we have this ability to choose how we respond, which Susan David calls emotional agility. So we have this emotional warning system, and between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space, so Viktor Frankl had this great quote, in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response is where our growth and freedom are, in that space. So emotions aren't bad. Emotions are just emotions, and they're giving us our warning system about where we are. So let me give you an example of what it might feel like when we're not functioning from our best selves, or our place of wellness, or innate goodness, or whatever word you want to use. But imagine your thoughts. Let's start over that. Whenever you're feeling overwhelmed and your head feels like the inside of a snow globe that's been shaken, that's not our space of well-being, right? Everybody has had that experience where their head's spinning a million miles an hour, and they've got so many thoughts, and it's racing, and we're ruminating on thoughts. So what we want to do is we want to get to this place where we recognize that there's a clearer view. So in order to get that snow to settle in a globe, you're not going to shake it. You're not going to pick individual snowflakes out and evaluate them. What you're going to do is find what we're all capable of doing, is finding that space and recognizing what our heads are doing, snow globing, and then wait for that clearest view. So it is important, right? Sometimes our heads are a blizzard and we have to make decisions. But there are a lot of times we are making decisions that are vulnerable decision points. When our head is a snow globe that has been shaken up for the last four or 5 minutes, and we're making decisions from there. And what I'm suggesting to you is that's not where we want to make decisions from. We want to make decisions from our own well-being. So I'm going to try to help connect the dots here. Let's share one example of why this is important. So if you look at the 7 phases of acting out cycle of behavior, we have an opportunity as educators to do our best to interrupt the cycle. We all know this. We all know that part of our job is de-escalating youth. And there are a multitude of vulnerable decision points that are there in this process. So how we respond as an educator matters. How we show up matters. Our well-being matters. So our well-being directly impacts how we're going to respond to helping de-escalate a student. We have the opportunity here to recognize the rumble strips are telling us, man, my mood, man, I'm off. And notice the space. If we notice the mood is telling us we're on the road about to head into the ditch, then what we can do is recognize that. Recognize there's space. We have time to make some course adjustment. We want to notice the space. We don't want to make it worse by shaking up the globe and feeding all of that. We don't even need to investigate the globe. What we need to do is notice the globe has been shaken up, and then we can move from living where it's a stimulus and a reaction to a stimulus and space and a reaction. So to summarize here, we want to see clearly that there is space between how we feel and how we respond. This space is where we're going to have the clearest view. It's where we're going to be able to tap into our own resilience and the resilience of everyone around us. This awareness, this pause, gives us enough space to respond versus react. Recognizing this space is one way to cultivate self-awareness, and recognizing this is a mindfulness strategy that we can all use to show up as our best selves. Being mindful of, are we about to head off the road? Being mindful of, is our head a big giant blizzard? And instead of making it unintentionally, making it harder on ourselves, we can do things with mindfulness that will help make it easier on ourselves. So Kimberly and I have a couple of definitions in here. I'm just going to touch briefly on this because I'm running a little bit behind. But so mindfulness, so we've covered that we can talk about stress in individuals. We talked about burnout in organizations. We've reviewed why educator wellness matters. We've covered that we all have the ability to be aware of the space between our thoughts, our snow globe, and our actions. And now we're going to dive deeper into the mindfulness piece, the mindfulness strategy. And remember, we're still on the first prong. We're still on individuals. So mindfulness has a variety of catch-all kind of definitions. So some meditation traditions reserve mindfulness for walking through life and noticing when your mind wanders. So instead of eating your lunch, your eating and your mind is focused on whoever just upset you. Or some meditations reserve mindfulness for a stand-in for meditation. So they just mix the two. And mindfulness and meditation they're not always the same thing. So we need to be aware of that. Another common meaning of mindfulness refers to that floating awareness that witnesses whatever happens when you experience life without judging or reacting to it. An example of that is you notice that you're headed off the curb from the rumble strips and your mood has really been impacted by something. You have the ability to notice that and then correct through mindfulness strategies. So some people also use the mindfulness word when they're actually talking about mindfulness-based stress reduction. And Kimberly's going to talk about the research here in a second, but the mindfulness-based stress reduction program it was developed in the 70s by John Kabat-Zinn, and it's taught all over the world, hospitals, schools, businesses, all of these places. It's an 8-week course that offers training in meditation, yoga, and strategies to handle stress. So mindfulness means different things to different people. So when you're talking about it with each other, it would be important for you to define that. Just like meditation is a catch-all for tons of contemplative practices, like sports is for athletics, right? So sports is kind of that big piece where soccer and football and baseball and basketball all fall underneath. The end results really do depend upon what you do in your practice. So there's one goal in meditation, and that is letting go of the constant grasping, recognizing the stickiness of our thoughts, which is another way of saying that big snow globe, and not letting that guide us through our days, but instead finding that space, being mindful of that space, and then recognizing it. Meditation practice has meditators. So if I go sit on my meditation cushion, my practice, if I'm doing a mindfulness-based practice, is I'm going to be recognizing that I have a thought about lunch, and then I have a thought about laundry, and then I have a thought about blah, 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 and then recognizing it and bringing my attention back to some present moment piece of information, like maybe my breath. I had a time when I was doing meditation, I actually got up off my meditation cushion and I walked out of the room to go do something before I realized I was doing my meditation practice. That's a good non-example, actually. So these things happen, right? This is practice. We're cultivating self-awareness. We're cultivating mindfulness. All right, so how does this go together? Well, focusing on one thing is one of the mechanics of meditation, and noticing when your mind wanders off. And concentration and mindfulness go hand in hand. So I'm going to have Kimberly, who speaks way more eloquently than I in general, but also about this research around mindfulness. And then I have a couple more pieces, and then I'm going to toss it back over to her full time. So Kimberly, mindfulness observations.
No pressure there, Amy. And I think John Kabat-Zinn would say you getting up and walking out of the end of your is perfectly fine. Because
no judgment, but pretty fascinating, I can say.
So the research, I love the research. And if you're a research geek, the Altered Traits book really takes the history of the research. Notice the language here, it's noteworthy observations from the research. Because this research, when it started and continues, it's, if you can imagine, it's kind of hard to create a research design to measure strong relationships. However, there are so many patterns in the research, and we've gone up to close to over 1,000 studies being published every year now, that it really does warrant continued inquiry and curiosity around what happens when. So this is just one article highlighting specifically mindfulness in education. And they had some good pieces in the research design, which was fabulous. It shows the evolution in how we're constructing our research design to really pinpoint the impact of mindfulness in education. But these are just some noteworthy observations. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but you can see kind of some of the outcomes, and some of them had strong predictive relationships, if you will, and they used 3 different measures in addition to the traditional self-report and surveying. They also use classroom observations to look at teacher behavior and student behavior. And so if you look at the next graphic that they shared in this article, and the citation, full citation is at the end. But if you look at the graphic at the next slide, I said the terrible word, Amy, that you have control over the slide. Next slide.
Amy can't seem to find her mouse situation. There we go. Got it.
That's perfectly fine too. So what I love about this is the authors attempted to give a potential explanation as to why this teachers, that they used all 3 types of measures, the self-report, the interview, and the observation. They give us a potential explanation for how this came to be, because as you can imagine, again, it's really hard to design research to measure the impact of this. But you can see where they look at just the intervention of this mindfulness practice, and they did tease out exactly what that was, which is really helpful in this research, because as Amy said, there's this catch-all for mindfulness. So what does that look like and sound like? And they show you the progression of a potential explanation of how we got to that space, filling that space that Amy spoke to, was slowing down, calm, relaxation, and how it started to change perceptions. And they pulled that from report and surveys. And then they looked at teacher and student behavior in the classroom to get to this particular study, which was looking at person-centered teaching practices, which really impacts relationships between teacher and student. And what they showed was a really strong inverse relationship between increased mindfulness and decrease in direct teacher talk, which is like lecturing and things of that nature. They weren't able to show a relationship between increasing indirect talk, but it's a start. So if you want more research, that was just a quick Cliff Note version, but the book, and there's actually a journal on mindfulness that is fabulous resource for those of you who want to geek out on the research. So I'll stop.
Thank you, Kimberly. Kimberly, I love to be around Kimberly because she's really good at geeking out around research. All right, so we've been talking, here's the groundwork. Stress is about individuals. Burnout is about organizations, needs an organizational support. We've been talking about how we function psychologically, right? How we have that opportunity for space between the stimulus and the response. And so we're going to tie this section all up with really thinking individuals first prong, and reminding you that the there is huge importance on your self-efficacy beliefs. Self-efficacy means you believe that you have the power to make a difference, which you do, but how much you believe that matters. And self-efficacy really connects back to our work. Self-efficacy connects back to that you have the ability to recognize the snow globe and to not make things like to not make decisions from the snow globe. So we each have these individual responsibilities to continue to grow and develop, and show up as our best selves, to make decisions from a place of well-being. And that self-efficacy piece, there's even research behind. We know that teachers' sense of self-efficacy is a significant predictor of productive teaching practices. There's a link between whether or not you think you can do it and whether or not you do it. So when we move to prong 2, it's when we recognize this all can't fall on individual educators. This has to be about collective efficacy and the systems and organizations that Kimberly is going to talk about. So while we're switching PowerPoints, I'm going to say a few words about trees, and we're going to ask you to put something in chat. So here's the thing. I don't know if you know this, if you've read The Hidden Life of Trees or not, but it is a magical book that teaches you about how trees communicate with each other all the time. They help each other. They help give each other water when another tree needs it. They move in certain ways so other trees can get light. They tell each other, this is so magical, they tell each other when there's an invasive species coming. We need to be like these trees. We need to have a collective effort to help move this forward. So while Kimberly gets set up, if you could put in chat one takeaway from the first prong, that would be great. And Kimberly, are you set?
I don't want to jinx myself, so give me a second. Let me make sure I'm set. Am I set?
You are set. You are set.
And I can't see the chat now, so I'm going to miss all these wonderful responses. I'll look for them later. If you can see the chat, Amy and/or Erin.
Yes.
Let me know when you'd like me to start.
All right. I was looking in the wrong chat. One second.
Getting a lot of great responses, Kim. I'd be happy to read some to you, or if you want to go ahead and get started, and we'll see them at the end. But quite a few responses, a lot of takeaways from the first session. Thank you, Amy.
A couple to highlight, Erin?
Sure.
Since I can't see.
Burnout is about the organization, not the person. Not to respond from a snow globe mindset. Those are the general ones that we're getting now.
Going to see an uptake in snow globe purchases across the country now.
Exactly.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
exactly. All right. Kimberly's going to take us here to collective efficacy.
Yes. So Amy talked about self-efficacy, and we're going to move into collective efficacy and the second chunk of this session, if you will. And that is, how do we use these key features of an MTSS to think about how we're organizing and aligning and allocating these resources so that we do have an organizational response to burnout, to help with a protective factor against stress. And so when you look at back to the American Institute of Stress that Amy referenced earlier, very clearly they give us a recommendation, and that is to use, lo and behold, a preventative healthcare approach to look at stress and how that we can use this as a protective factor. And so that's not surprising to me because that is upstream efforts like Amy alluded to. So if we look at the research around teacher well-being, it's really looking at teacher well-being, to Amy's point, the second prong, and that is it's constructed in relation to the context, of course, school culture and environment. And what I thought was great that we proved with research, but we probably all could say, yes, we knew that, was that while there's appreciation maybe for these compulsory well-being activities or initiatives that districts and schools are arranging for teachers and staff members, they're done so typically outside of the workday hours. Those actually have a negative impact on teacher well-being, in part because you're adding additional demands to teacher time, staff time. And so the other part of this that I did want to highlight for us is thinking about voice and choice. When we look at PBIS, MTSS implementation, it gives us that platform that says this is a collective effort. And so how do we use this platform to, again, not assume, not do to, but do with? You know, as Amy said, stress is different for all of us. Our stress response system looks different for all of us. So how do we do this with input from staff, just like we do everything else with implementation within this MTSS? And so really the preference here is how do we embed into our school culture wellness? How do we look at decreasing workloads, which Dr. Jamison, I think, spoke to this morning, you know, like how do we stop doing things that maybe we don't have any evidence around, or maybe we don't know if they're working? How do we maximize opportunities for agency, voice and choice? And how do we cultivate healthy relationships as a way of supporting teacher efficacy? Thinking of those trees, the life of the trees, like how do we cultivate that for ourselves? And when you look at the definition of stress, again, from the American Institute of Stress, the recipe is the level of demands plus the ability to navigate them. And so this reflects very much so kind of the antidote or the protective factor, if you will, through an organizational lens of what we can do for teacher well-being. So why would we use this MTSS framework? Well, it does involve a collective effort for implementation. It's not meant to be one person. It's including voice and choice along the way, everything we do. It focuses on changing our systems. So remember the burnout mantra? Burnout is about your organization, not your people. And we are focused on systems and changing those systems with MTSS. Not to say the other prong of self-care isn't important, because it is. And a framework allows us to look at everything we're doing, our resources. How are we organizing those resources to meet the continuum of needs for all of our staff? And some and a few. And Erin is on the phone or on the call, and she had this great metaphor. I hope you don't mind me sharing, Erin, but she took the metaphor of, you know, how we're always told to reach for our oxygen mask first before we help others. And she said, yeah, but what if the system isn't dropping the oxygen mask? What if the plane doesn't drop the oxygen mask? If I'm in snow globe, is there a system in place that I can access easily to help me navigate when I may not be regulated or in that space? And so I love that analogy, metaphor that Erin offered us. And I think it's a really good example here to illustrate the need for this organizational approach. We also have research that we know when implemented with fidelity, we can improve teacher efficacy. There was a whole research done, Catherine Bradshaw did, about OHI, organizational health, and using that inventory as one of the measures. And we know that we can increase that protective factor for staff when we implement with fidelity. And so there is I'm going to say brief from our center. We're not so brief in case you haven't noticed, but there's a brief from our center that really teases out something that I don't know if Mona B is in this session or not, but I noticed in the chat this morning during the keynote, she mentioned that this work requires a shift in our focus. And this brief really unpacks what are those shifts. And specifically, it looks at a shift in collaboration, a shift in our database decision-making, like how are we expanding our data we're looking at and how we're engaging with that, and a shift in our strategy. And so we're going to highlight just a few concrete examples from this brief. And there's a Word document in the file section for this session that has all of the hyperlinks for you. So you can grab that before you leave or afterwards. That'll give you easy access to these resources. But if we look to just some of those shifts that are really unpacked in depth in that brief, of course, we're going to think about our circles and our data sources being one of those to inform the need. Because remember, we can have the negative impact if we just assume we know what everybody's stress response looks like. And we want to make sure that we're asking people. And I would argue we don't need necessarily to go out and get some new data source. We have lots of naturally occurring data sources available to us. And I always want everyone, organizations, to look at what you have first. And then if you need something else, okay, we'll talk. But you can think about naturally occurring data sources. You know, regular check-ins, which I'll show you some examples that we do with staff when we have meetings or team meetings or staff meetings. Those give us great data. You know, suggestion boxes, just things to ask a prompt, a question. We can look at our attrition and retention data, and we do that. And I would say if we're at a school level, we can do that across the school. And I guarantee there are some patterns, some predictive patterns of when those things happen. And if I'm at a district level, I wonder what would happen if we pulled that data together across schools and thought of, here's a pattern, and it's impacting a large number of our schools. Is there a way to efficiently organize our resources? What do we have? What do we need? How will we use them to get in front of this situation, get in front of the attrition and retention issue? And also EAP, our employee assistant programs. I would be curious to know if districts and state schools look at the data to see what are the types of resources people are accessing. Are there things that people are asking for that we don't have available? Can we shift that data, expand the resources to enhance our EAP to meet that continuum of needs? And there are other options out there. The professional quality of life measure is an instrument. I haven't used this personally, but Amy might be able to add to any information about it. Anything to say about that, Amy?
Yeah, it could be a helpful tool to use. I mean, there are other ones as well, but the professional quality of life is a measure that you could have people do in a staff meeting so that it's not adding to their to-do list. It has 30 items on it. It looks at the positive and the negative pieces of kind of how you're experiencing work. And then it also will give you some subscale information around compassion fatigue, burnout, and compassion satisfaction, meaning what is it that makes you keep coming back to work that is so rewarding. And, you know, my colleague Katie Pullman at Midwest talks and has some experience with having people do that in a staff meeting anonymously, but then collecting their data in aggregate so that they can measure it as a whole staff. So it's not something you would want to ask somebody to fill out and then like write Amy in big letters on the top. I don't want someone to have my individual score, but if you could collect those scores and look at them in aggregate, that could be really helpful. And it's free, and there's a link on the slide for you.
Thank you, Amy. That resource is also on that Word document. So we talk about shifts also in our policies and our focus, if you will. And so thinking about a strategic plan, that's a great place that if we truly value staff wellness, staff well-being, and I would argue administrator and district as well. I think those are some very lonely roles these days, especially. But is that reflected in our policies and in our focus? A district I worked with recently, the superintendent added more time, planning time, downtime for staff because it's so overwhelming. The needs are so overwhelming right now. Can we look at the EAP? You know, when I think about a district leadership team, is HR on that team? Somebody who can think about our employee assistance programs and really inventorying what do we have, what do we need. And so as you think about policies and focus, and if we were to say, yes, we value this, and our actions, we need to show that, as Amy talked about, leaders walking the walk, like, do we value it enough to actually say, you know what, I'm going to find 15 minutes for my self-care part of this. I'm going to model that so that employees see me as the leader modeling that. And so just thinking about that, as a district, as a school, what is the challenge, and what might you say no to if you're saying yes to this? And so a lot of us, say we don't have time for this. I would argue we don't have time not to do this, right? So thinking about that. Resource mapping and initiative mapping, for me, this is a wellness strategy. And I think it's overlooked and undervalued as a way to improve our systems, because when you think about the recipe for stress, level of demands, ability to navigate, when you resource or initiative map, looking at all that you have, it gives you an opportunity to say, we're going to stop doing these things. That decreases demand. We're going to stop doing them because we don't have evidence that they're working. We don't have data that says they're working for us. And it allows us to look at alignment above the level of implementation. So teachers, as Amy talked about, this doesn't fall on the shoulders of teachers. Well, neither does implementation. And so instead of a teacher saying, oh, we've got all these multiple initiatives, remember the slide that Kent showed this morning. How do we align those multiple initiatives within this framework? Those are the outcomes we're seeking. That should not fall on a teacher or an administrator's shoulders. That should be above the level of implementation. So for me, resource mapping and initiative mapping, such a great tool. And I think we overlook the opportunity to use this tool to help us examine our systems and the demands we're placing on one another. And so you might think about, well, gosh, what do we have? What if we did resource map, like maybe within a school, maybe within the district, maybe within the district community connection? What's available to us in our continuum of supports for all staff, some, and a few? So we're taking that same logic of MTSS because it's the tool, the framework that helps us identify, organize, and deploy our resources in the most efficient and effective way. And so what a great opportunity for us to start to look at, what do we already have before we start that SOS, shiny object syndrome? I love how Erica McDowell talks about that. I really want to stop SOS in education. Let's just focus on what we're doing, and let's align what we're doing and do small things well that have the biggest impact, right? So start to thinking about, how do we normalize this? If we say we value staff wellness, a culture of wellness, how do we start to normalize, standardize our practices, make it okay, so that we can address that barrier that Amy talked to? And so some examples of that might look like, we use standard agendas. It's one of our operating procedures. Can you just have a standing agenda item checking in with folks? Can you look at your norms and ensure that they not only reflect operational norms, but also social emotional well-being norms? And I'll show you some examples of those. How can we look at maybe using our teaching matrices to start to normalize some of these things? And so I love Brene Brown's work, and I use it quite a bit. And she does a great job of unpacking empathy. I think it's in this one, The Gifts of Imperfection, but she breaks it down into 4 skill sets. And so why not unpack empathy instead of just saying show empathy? What does that look like and sound like? Unpack it into the skill sets. And here is an example of some norms that we might, consider for our team, so that we are standardizing and normalizing this notion of the culture of wellness. We might also infuse those into a teaching matrix. So you can see where this school looked at wellness as a whole category. Like, how are we taking, what our school counselor does, what we do, what people are asking for, and put it on our matrix? How do we infuse it throughout the matrix as well? And just as an aside, I love that this part of this matrix, where if we're co-creating our matrix, our school-wide matrix with our school community, staff and students, what a great data source that says, okay, these are the things we say we value, and we're going to support habit building around. What do we need from teachers? What do we need from family to help us build these habits? So that starts to impact students as well. So thinking about all the things we've talked to, what Amy brought to us in terms of that prong about self-care, because it is critical, and making this a priority for ourselves, because we can't give the oxygen mask without taking care of ourselves. Think about, what are you going to commit to? And how can we open up that conversation for all of our staff? And I love this, this thought here for us to kind of end on, if you will. And that is, whether you and I and a few others will renew this world someday, it remains to be seen. But within ourselves, we must renew it each day. And so Amy and Aaron and I invite you to think about that last thought before this. What is your commitment to yourself? It starts with all of us. And when we start to embrace that, normalize that, we can start to look at also that organizational response to our collectiveness. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, but as I just transition to that, I also want to put the evaluation slide up, because we wanted to leave a few minutes for us to explore any questions together. We have a wealth of knowledge on this in this session, not just the three of us. Here is our contact information while you're posting questions. All of these resources are in the Word document for you. I love this one. I think it's a fabulous resource. Some of the resources for the research, for those of you who want to have coffee tomorrow morning before conference. And here's the evaluation information as well for this session. So I'm going to leave that just for a second. It looks like you can also get to it via the platform itself. I live in Virginia Beach.
Aaron,
You're the
Aaron, oh, hey, Aaron, could you put that link in the chat, this Pathable chat too?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. I'll stop sharing and see if we have any questions we all want to explore together. I still can't see the chat. Anything? No.
Aaron, I'm not seeing any, are you?
I was typing in the evaluation link. So that is in the chat now. A couple questions in reference to the books that were shared at the beginning, and then in reference to downloading the slides. I can let you know that if you go to the Files tab right at the top of this chat section and click Files, you can download the slides in there. So that is the answer to that. And then in reference to the books, do you guys want to mention again those phenomenal book resources that you shared throughout your session?
Sure, and they should also be listed in that document that Kimberly put together. The epidemic. What?
They should. You're right.
It should be. The burnout epidemic. Altered traits, which is, I found a pretty mind-blowing book, honestly. If you're somebody who's been interested in meditation and interested in the research, this book is, it's one of those books where Kimberly and I would text each other like, what? Did you read that part? And then this book called Emotional Agility by Susan David. And then Kimberly, can you hold up the Brene Brown book?
Oh, The Gifts of Imperfection. And I see a question in the chat about practical tools and practices. Team wellness while at school. So team wellness, beyond that though, I don't think I shared this comment. I've been taking a class that requires 8-hour days. And let me tell you, it is manageable because they have inserted what they call micro breaks. And so they built a routine, and there's some great research out there, even for movement in the classroom during this time. I think it might have been Jessica Swain Bradley who sponsored an event where someone was talking to this out of the Midwest or the Midwest Health. I always get your acronym incorrect, Jessica, but she was talking to the need for more movement. And so an 8-hour class for 4 days in a row, the routine is we do 50 minutes of instruction and we have a 10-minute break. And I would have thought I can't do 8 hours a day right now on Zoom, but with those micro breaks, I wonder what would happen if we had a school-wide micro break schedule that says, again, what are we saying no to if we're going to say yes to valuing wellness for all? It's not just for the students, it's for the adults too. I also would encourage you on the team wellness to think about adding that standing agenda item. One thing I've learned is I'm a little impatient sometimes. So if we go around, how you doing? And everybody reports out, it eats up all my minutes for the meeting. So I prefer to have something prepared for that, like, give an analogy of a song, or pick one of these pictures that reflects how you're feeling today, or something that's a quick check-in, but it's become normalized practice for us. We've standardized it, if you will. And then you've some other examples in the brief that we referenced. There are lots of concrete examples there, like that shift in collaboration. I absolutely love it. It talks to the flexibility of scheduling, rethinking collaboration among teachers. How do we do that as a protective factor against that recipe for stress, level of demand, ability to navigate, some agency there? Anything else, Amy or Erin?
I don't think so. And I was answering a question in chat, so I'm
Great.
I'm not your best ring woman right now.
We did have a few questions in the chat. First of all, just lots of thanks and thank you for your honesty and for sharing all these wonderful resources. In reference to, we've only got 3 minutes left in the session, so we may not be able to answer this question, but quite a few people asked about getting leadership or administration on board for supporting this culture of wellness in the schools. Do you have any immediate feedback or thoughts or references for that?
I want them to read Burnout, Amy.
To read Burnout. And, on our Midwest PBIS site, my colleague Katie has really done some great work about, and there's an entire module on it about leadership in the culture of wellness. So that could be a good place to start. And it's tying a lot of what Kimberly said together as well about, this has to be a culture. And then I know in Illinois, there's an administrator academy currently for leaders who want to focus on self-care that is coming up maybe in December. And I'm going to ask my colleague Katie if she's still on here, if she could put that link in there.
Yeah, and that link, I did manage to remember that link, Amy, to the Midwest site that has the that you were referring to. That is in the Word document.
Great. So if we don't get that link in never mind, Katie already did it. If you live in Illinois and you would like Administrator Academy credits, you can do that through West 40. And the content is, there's similar content in that day-long training. So
great. I am.
We hope.
Yeah.
We hope that you walk away with some new things to think about, and that you walk away remembering that this is not all about individuals, and it just can't be about all individuals, right? Our individual work is about showing up as our best selves and living the best life we can each live. And the burnout piece is really more about the systems and the organization. So we want to stop putting all of this on educators. So I think that's everything.
Receiving many thanks in the chat box. So many eye-opening things and things that many people needed to hear today and every day. So thank you both for sharing. The recording will be available on the website eventually. So it's here now, but it'll also be on the website eventually. So if you need to look back, or if you want to look at the slides and many of the references shared, by all means, please do, because there is a wealth of information. Thank you, Kim and Amy, for the session today. And we'll keep this open for the next couple minutes as people head out onto their next session and get their break. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin, so much for your help. And I was going to tell you that the PowerPoints and the recordings will be on PBIS.org in 2 weeks. It'll take about 2 weeks to get those all uploaded, but they'll all be there for free. All right. Have a great conference. Bye.